Have you ever considered that the sheer exhaustion you feel at 5 p.m. isn't actually from the physical work you did?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's from the invisible chaotic battles your brain was just fighting in the background all day long. I mean, we obsessively optimize our morning routines, right? We color code our calendars.
Every endless scheduling.
Exactly. We try to meticulously control all our external actions, but we completely ignore the engine that's actually generating all that output. We just treat our minds as, passive receptors, letting the Wild West kind of run its course.
We do. And I mean, the cost of that neglect is incredibly steep. We pour so much of our energy into managing the symptoms of our lives, right? But we leave the root cause, which is our internal cognitive state, completely unmanaged.
Yeah. So for this deep dive, we've got an excerpt from a really fascinating text called The Garden of the Mind. Specifically, we're looking at a section titled, How to Discipline Your Thinking.
It's a great section.
It really is. And our mission today is to map out the hidden mechanics of mental exhaustion. We want to uncover the practical framework this text lays out for actually guiding our thoughts, rather than just being helplessly dragged around by them.
Which is how most people feel, honestly.
Yeah, totally helpless.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's unpack this. I mean, where do we even begin to tackle a concept as massive as the internal state of the mind?
Well, I think we have to start by establishing exactly why this hierarchy of control matters to you, the listener. Because, if you spend your time trying to force yourself to work harder or communicate better, be more present, but your mind is fundamentally unfocused and negative, your external life will always mirror that internal chaos.
Wow.
You simply cannot build a focused, intentional life on top of a distracted, unmanaged mind. Like literally everything begins with the thought.
Right. So before we can even figure out how to guide the mind, we kind of have to look at the baseline state of an unmanaged one. And the source text gives us this character named Ethan, who really represents this default state for a lot of us.
He's the perfect example.
Yeah, he has this incredibly busy mind. His thoughts just never stop. He's caught in this brutal, involuntary pendulum swing.
And that pendulum is a highly accurate way to visualize it, I think. It's an oscillation between two distinct zones of powerlessness.
Powerlessness, right. Because on the backswing, he's basically trapped in the past. He's constantly replaying interactions, agonizing over mistakes, wondering what people thought of him.
Relitigating everything.
Exactly. And then the momentum carries that pendulum violently forward into the future. And he is just consumed by anticipation and dread. Like he's terrified of projects failing or, what if things go wrong? He's never just operating in the present moment.
Never.
And the result is that Ethan is completely exhausted. I mean, he doesn't run a marathon. He's just sitting at a desk. But he is mentally depleted.
He is entirely drained. And because he doesn't understand the mechanics of his own mind, he genuinely believes he's incapable of controlling his thoughts. He views his own cognition as something that just happens to him rather than something he actually has agency over.
Yeah, reading about Ethan's fatigue, the mental image that came to me wasn't just a busy guy. Ethan's brain is like a car stuck deep in the mud with the accelerator pushed to the floorboards.
That's a great way to put it.
Right, like a massive amount of fuel is being burned, the engine is screaming, the tires are just spinning violently, but there's absolutely zero forward momentum. It's just friction, heat, and completely wasted energy.
That captures the mechanical reality of his exhaustion perfectly. I mean, he is burning energy without traveling any distance at all.
But I actually want to push back on the text premise just a bit here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because if we look at Ethan's worries,
yeah,
reflecting on past mistakes so we can learn from them and trying to anticipate the future so we can prepare, isn't that just an evolutionary survival mechanism?
It is, yeah.
Like, isn't that literally how the human brain evolved to keep us safe? Why does this specifically result in such deep, paralyzing mental fatigue for him?
Well, it's a really critical distinction to make, and it comes down to the mechanics of cognitive load. So the fatigue doesn't actually stem from the act of purposeful, structured planning. It stems from the lack of intentionality.
Okay, intentionality.
Right. The text specifically notes that his mind is, quote, jumping from one idea to another. When you sit down with a notebook for 20 minutes to review a past mistake and, extract a concrete lesson, that is a highly intentional, productive use of executive function.
Right. That's actually helpful.
But when your brain suddenly forces you to relive a 5-year-old embarrassing memory while you're just standing in line for coffee or throws a worst-case scenario at you while you're trying to fall asleep, that is not intentional.
Oh, man, yeah. We've all been there.
Right. And that involuntary jumping, that constant unstructured context switching, it's highly metabolically expensive for the brain. It burns through your glucose reserves without producing any actionable output.
Yeah.
So it's not the thinking itself that exhausts Ethan. It's the chaotic, unguided nature of his rumination.
It's like having 100 web browser tabs open at once, and music is playing from one of them, but you have no idea which one.
Yes, perfect analogy.
So we're obsessively optimizing our output,
But come on.
completely ignoring the engine generating it. And because Ethan feels completely trapped in that driver's seat,
Yeah.
just spinning his wheels and fundamentally believing he cannot control his own mind, he's stuck.
Totally paralyzed.
Yeah, he needs a completely opposing framework to break out of this cycle. And that alternative is embodied by a character named Marcus.
Right, and Marcus is presented as the structural opposite of Ethan. Where Ethan is chaotic and depleted, Marcus possesses this calm, clear, and just very quiet energy.
So Ethan basically asks him how he manages to stay so grounded. And Marcus delivers what is really the central thesis of the text. He says, you don't control your life until you learn to control your thoughts.
Which is a thesis that completely reorders the traditional hierarchy of self-improvement, if you think about it.
How so?
Well, we usually assume that if we just get our schedules organized, if we just build the right external habits, eventually our minds will calm down.
Right. Fix the outside to fix the inside.
Exactly.
Right.
But Marcus argues that the calm mind is the absolute prerequisite. And he makes this critical clarification. Discipline isn't merely about the actions you take in the physical world. Discipline is fundamentally about how you process information internally.
He tells Ethan, you don't control every thought, but you can guide them. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because that distinction between controlling and guiding, it shifts the entire physics of the mind.
It really does.
Yeah, because think about it. Trying to stop every single anxious thought from popping into your head is like trying to build a massive concrete dam to stop a rushing river. You might hold the water back for a little while through sheer willpower, right?
Sure, for a minute.
But the pressure is going to build, the concrete's going to crack, and you are eventually going to get completely flooded by an anxiety attack or just a massive wave of overthinking. It's a system destined to fail.
Always.
But guiding your thoughts, that's not building a dam. That's digging irrigation channels. You're taking the kinetic energy of that rushing water and directing it where you actually want it to go. You aren't fighting the natural flow of your brain. You're giving it a productive path.
What's fascinating here is how Marcus is redefining the very concept of discipline.
Yeah, that word has a lot of baggage.
Right. For most of us, discipline carries an enormous amount of cultural baggage. It implies, harsh restriction, punishment, gritting your teeth, forcing yourself into compliance. It's a very aggressive posture.
Yeah, like a drill sergeant in your head.
Exactly. But Marcus dismantles that. He frames mental discipline as a gentle, intentional redirection. It's not about punishing yourself for having a fearful thought. It's about gently taking the steering wheel and turning the vehicle back onto the road.
It changes discipline from a weapon into a tool. But Marcus doesn't just offer Ethan a philosophical reframe here. He actually gives him a diagnostic toolkit to implement this redirection in his daily life.
And this is where it gets really practical for the listener.
Yeah, the mechanics. So the first component Marcus introduces is simply observation. He tells Ethan to just notice his thoughts without reacting immediately. And then the second part of that is to evaluate the thought by asking one question. Is this helpful?
Which sounds simple, but...
Well, I actually have to jump in here because let's look at this practically. Say you receive an incredibly vague, ominous email from your boss at 4:59 p.m. on a Friday.
Oh, the classic Friday afternoon anxiety bomb.
Right. Your heart rate spikes, your breathing gets shallow, you're spiraling into a panic about losing your job. In that exact moment, isn't it basically biologically impossible to just casually stop and objectively ask yourself, gee, is this thought helpful?
Oh, 100%. If you attempt to leap straight to evaluating the thought while you are actively spiraling, yes, it will absolutely fail.
So what's the trick?
Well, in that moment, the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical reason part of your brain, is being entirely overridden by the amygdala, your threat detection center. This is exactly why the text sequences the mechanics the way it does. Step 1, noticing and pausing, is the mandatory biological prerequisite for step 2.
Okay. The pause is the key.
Exactly. When you're caught in that Friday afternoon email spiral, you are fused with the panic. You believe the panic is reality. The act of noticing, of intentionally pausing for even just 3 seconds and saying, I am experiencing a thought about losing my job, it creates a wedge.
It separates you from it.
Yes, it unfuses you. That pause down-regulates the amygdala just enough to bring the prefrontal cortex back online. You cannot evaluate a fire while you believe you are the fire. You have to step back and become the observer first. Only then does the question, is this helpful, have any actual mechanical power?
That makes absolute logical sense. The pause is the mechanism that allows the logic to work at all. Okay, so once you establish that gap and evaluate if the thought is actually helpful, the text moves into what we do with our attention next. The third habit Marcus teaches is focusing exclusively on what you can control.
And this is incredibly difficult because, well, the human brain's negativity bias compels us to want to solve everything.
Right, we want to fix it all.
We expend vast amounts of mental energy worrying about macroeconomic trends or what other people think of us or highly unpredictable future events. By actively routing our attention back to our immediate sphere of influence, our actions, our responses, our preparation, we start burning fuel, spinning our tires in the mud. We regain forward momentum.
Which leads directly into the physical environment, actually. The final habit in Marcus's toolkit is reducing distractions to give the mind the quiet it needs to think clearly. And this really feels like an acknowledgement that our external environment is just constantly hijacking our internal state.
It comes down to cognitive load theory again. If you are constantly bombarded by notifications, news alerts, and background noise, your brain is forced to process all of that stimuli.
Right, it takes energy.
Exactly. It consumes your working memory. You cannot effectively observe and guide your internal thoughts if your mental bandwidth is entirely maxed out just processing external distractions. Quiet isn't just some luxury. It is a mechanical requirement for cognitive guidance.
Okay, so we have these four mechanics: pause, evaluate, focus on agency, and reduce noise. And to tie this all together into a usable mental model, the text provides a very specific metaphor. Your thoughts are a garden.
It's a classic metaphor for a reason. And the fundamental rule of any garden is that if you do not actively manage what grows there, weeds will take over by default. Right, the weeds of worry, insecurity, and past regret, they do not require fertilizer. They don't require your permission. They thrive on neglect, cultivating focus, calm, and intentionality that requires the active stewardship of a gardener.
Yeah, and we see Ethan take this garden metaphor and apply the mechanics in real time. And I appreciate that the text doesn't sugarcoat this process. It isn't some miraculous overnight transformation where he suddenly achieves perfect Zen clarity.
No, not at all.
He struggles. The mental habits are incredibly difficult at first because the weeds, in his mind, have deep established root system.
He'd been growing for years.
Exactly. But he persists through practical actions. He starts writing his thoughts down to understand them. He intentionally leaves his phone in another room to manufacture quiet. He practices single tasking.
Which is huge.
Yeah. And that first detail, writing his thoughts down, directly mirrors the garden metaphor. Because when a fear is just bouncing around the echo chamber of your skull, it feels massive and undefined. But writing it down on paper is the equivalent of reaching into the soil, pulling that weed out by the roots, and holding it under a light.
That's a powerful way to look at it.
You can finally examine its structure. You can look at the paper and objectively ask, is this helpful? And more often than not, seeing the irrationality written out in ink just strips it of its power.
Because writing externalizes the internal chaos. And the timeline the text portrays here is vital for the listener to understand. Like you said, Ethan doesn't write in a journal once and magically fix his brain. The text notes that days pass, then weeks.
It takes time.
Right. Slowly, incrementally, the mental jumping begins to slow down. Building a disciplined mind is an act of neural conditioning. You are strengthening literal neural pathways through repetition. It is a muscle that requires consistent resistance training.
Days, then weeks of pulling weeds. It's a grind.
Oh.
But the payoff is profound. The text is careful to emphasize that Ethan doesn't eradicate every negative thought forever.
That would be impossible.
Right. The weeds still occasionally pop up. But the exhaustion is gone. His mind is calmer, he has access to his own focus, and he realizes he is no longer the victim of his neurochemistry. And when he reunites with Marcus, he says this great line, I can't stop every thought, but I can choose which ones to follow.
I can choose which ones to follow. That is the operational definition of mental freedom right there. The weeds will always exist in the environment, sure, but he now has the agency and the tools to pluck them out before they establish a canopy and choke out everything else.
So what does this all mean? If we synthesize Ethan's journey and Marcus's framework, it brings us directly back to you, the listener. It's the realization that while you cannot control the initial emergence of an anxious or unhelpful thought, you cannot build a dam to stop the river, you have total agency over what happens next. You can build a stronger, intentional mind by starting incredibly small. It begins with just the simple act of noticing, implementing that 3-second pause to unfuse yourself from the chaos.
And within that 3-second pause, you can deploy the core diagnostic question from the text, carrying it into every hour of your day. Are my thoughts helping me or hurting me?
Such a great filter.
It's a binary filter that instantly cuts through the noise of rumination. If a thought isn't serving a productive purpose, you refuse to water it. You let it go and redirect your attention to what you actually can control.
And you don't need to retreat to a mountaintop to do this,
Oh,
right?
sure.
You can pull a mental weed while sitting in rush hour traffic or waiting for a meeting to start.
Which leaves us with a truly profound implication to consider as we wrap up this analysis. We've examined the daily mechanics of pulling the weeds of unhelpful thoughts and intentionally planting focus. And the text showed us Ethan's progress over a matter of weeks.
Right.
But if we project this forward, it raises a really compelling question about the long-term architecture of the brain.
Oh, I like where this is going.
Well, think about it. If you spend months or even years consistently refusing to give your attention to the weeds of anxiety, and instead you systematically cultivate calm and intentionality, what happens to the fundamental soil of your mind?
Wow.
Does the landscape of your brain eventually undergo such deep neuroplastic changes that the soil itself becomes inhospitable to unstructured worry? Like, does the baseline of your consciousness permanently shift so that those chaotic thoughts struggle to even take root in the first place?
The idea that you aren't just indefinitely managing a broken system, but actively rewriting the physical landscape of your brain so the weeds can't even grow, that is an incredibly powerful pursuit. We invite you to test these mechanics in your own mental garden this week. Carve out the pause, evaluate the roots, and see what you can grow. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.